Well, good afternoon. It looks like we're live here. My name is Gabriel Collins. I'm one of the research fellows here at the Baker Institute. I've run a global research portfolio. China's a major component of that. And that's really what we're going to focus on today is how the evolving US-China strategic relationship is impacting activities in the energy space on a local level, on a regional level, and on a global level as well. And so we wanted to thank you for taking this time with us. We're very glad you're here, and we're also very glad to bring you two wonderful experts. One of our in-house people, Dr. Stephen Lewis, and then our guest speaker, Andrew Erickson, Dr. Andrew Erickson from the U.S. Naval War College. In terms of protocol today, I have a brief set of framing remarks, and then I'll very rapidly turn over to Doctors Erickson and Lewis for respective views looking at the US-China relationship, and then a deep dive into some of the things that are going on right now in Chinese domestic politics that are likely to affect what goes on in the energy space. And to all the members of the audience, and this is speaking from my own short attention span, is more than a few minutes of listening to somebody else talk's a little rough. And so if you want to go ahead and pepper us with questions on the fly, we'll be very happy to rotate those in. We think that facilitates a better discussion and better engagement. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and launch here. So in terms of viewing this issue broadly, the way we view it is intensifying strategic tensions between the US and the People's Republic of China are likely to profoundly influence global energy markets during the 2020s. Our two countries are the world's largest energy consumers, the largest carbon emitters, and the largest economies, and they're arguably the world's single most influential industrial and technological players as well. To give a little bit of context, China and the US alone accounted for 40% of global primary energy usage in 2018, according to the BP data. And this is about 221 quadrillion British thermal units. And for those who aren't necessarily ready to ruin their happy hour by thinking about what 15 zeros after a set of numbers means, it's enough energy that you could actually boil Lake Erie more than once. Now, as we approach such a massive scale issue, we're going to see multiple layers, both of strategic friction and of strategic opportunity, that are going to interact in dynamic and often unpredictable ways. On one end of the spectrum, you have obviously the very undesirable potential outcome of something akin to a Cold War, or even potentially kinetic conflict. We think that's very low probability. Obviously, there would be profound energy impacts. I think on the most positive end, which is also probably lower probability given some of the dynamics that we see and we'll discuss, academic, commercial, and governmental actors in China and the US could spearhead the development and large-scale deployment of technologies that would address multiple climate and emissions issues for the betterment of the entire planet. Reality is most likely going to find our country somewhere in between if we were to ask where the relationship will be come 2030. And reality generally does not regress neatly to the mean. And there's a real possibility that the 2020s, with the right policy steps taken and the right evolutions, could be a decade of rebuilding and recovery between the United States and China. But more pessimistically, it could also be more akin to the 1930s, albeit with somewhat different central players. And the bottom line is that decisions made at all levels in each of our large, dynamic, and complex societies are going to invoke formidable human, technical, and financial powerhouses that, really, I think have not, in many ways, it's an unprecedented set of circumstances. And one of the things that ties us all together is that uncertainty abounds. I think one of the key objectives that we have today is to acknowledge this and to help start building a framework that a range of interested parties can use as they think about some of these issues and how they're likely to evolve, and also to really emphasize where are our blind spots and what are the points of uncertainty as we head into the 2020s. And with that, we thank you again for joining us, and I turn over to Dr. Erickson.
Well, thank you very much, Gabe, and also to Dr. Lewis and the Baker Institute. This is a real honor for me, and I've always thought very highly of Secretary Baker and President Bush. I'll never forget when President Bush came to my small hometown of Williamstown, Mass. As a young boy, I ran up to the rope line to shake his hand. Then I ran down the rope line to shake his hand again. Without missing a beat, he said, "Well, hello there again, young man." And that was one of the many things that really called me to public policy, that sense of being there to try to contribute to a greater good. And I really value the fact that we can have this discussion today, sharing some strictly personal academic views on my part, because one of the brilliant things about the way policy is made and implemented in this country is it's part of a long and highly participatory process, and that sometimes takes a while for things to ramp up and to get at some of the issues that you were referring to in your introduction. But when the process finally goes through, I think it's a very resilient and durable and effective one. So I don't think we're going to solve all the challenges today, but I think this is going to be one of many efforts that together end up getting us there in the future. And to that end, I want to start out by raising and offering food for thought on three questions. And I'm not going to use the old academic trick of just throwing those questions back to the audience and never taking a cut myself. I don't think that's a fair approach. So since we're surrounded by a difficult situation in U.S.-China relations, U.S. policy toward China, and related dynamics, I think we really need to default to three basic questions that you pretty much always need to try to have the best possible answer to. Namely, one, where have we been? Number two, where are we now? And number three, where might we go? So at the beginning here, I'd just like to offer some initial thoughts on those questions to try to get the ball rolling. In terms of where have we been? This is something that many different people bring many different experiences to, and I look forward to hearing some of Dr. Lewis's insights, since he has a much longer and more distinguished track record of experience than I do. But I would like to share a bit of a flavor of what I experienced about 2 decades ago in a series of government internships in college, both around Washington and also with the State Department in Hong Kong and Beijing. And if you match the timeline up, I think we can argue that 2 decades ago was about the time when some very serious questions relating to U.S. policy toward China, U.S.-China relations, and China's role on the world stage were being discussed and debated and ultimately decided and implemented. Now, at the time, from my very lowly intern position, the sense that I got was that people came at those questions from very different backgrounds and prior assumptions, but many of them, a majority, one could argue, coalesced around the idea that it made sense to engage more deeply with China and work to try to help bring China more deeply into the international community and its systems and its protocols and its agreements, because this was on the right path to progress in the future. Now, as we get toward the second question, I think what's become clear is that those policies of what loosely might be termed deep engagement have largely run their course, run out of gas, as I imagine you might put it. And one thing that comes out of all this is realizing that even at the point of peak agreement among many people that was a path worth pursuing, there were many different assumptions about why it was a path worth pursuing. Some people genuinely believed that China's policies could be shaped, influenced, encouraged in the most cooperative and positive sense. I think some people, many people, looked at the way that the disintegration of the Soviet Union had occurred so rapidly and so relatively peacefully, had looked at the horrors of what the Tiananmen massacre had inflicted upon China's own citizens, and just thought the government that we're dealing with in Beijing will not long persist in its present form. It will have to adapt necessarily in a direction that we think will be better welcomed by Chinese citizens and by the world writ large. And I think still other people had a more general view that things were evolving in a positive trend toward globalization, and a lot of the values and priorities that the United States has promoted writ large. And so why not keep building that momentum? Things will sort out in the right direction. Well, that brings us to where we are today. And as usual, there's no full consensus. There shouldn't be. We're a democracy debating things. But I do think there's an unusually widespread sentiment. And that sentiment, it could be summed up as the situation with US-China relations is not good. I find it hard to imagine that more than a very small fraction of people would debate that broader consensus point. Now, of course, below that are underneath that, under informing that, playing into that are many different views about why US-China relations are not doing so well. Is it more a question of disappointment that things did not work out as hoped? Is for some people, it's more of an issue of not disappointment because they never thought it would work out well this way in the first place. Now, in 2020 hindsight, I think that group has grown over the past 2 decades, but there were definitely sincere believers from the start who never thought that that could work. So they're another part of the debate. I don't believe in having an extended discussion of who was quote unquote right, who was quote unquote wrong, who predicted things quote unquote accurately or not. So I'd like to move on to what I think is the third and most important question, namely, where might we go from here? And that's both the most important question and really the most difficult one to answer. It cannot be answered even in the context of our robust hour-long discussion, but it's definitely important to get started. So I wanted to offer some framing thoughts. I would submit that we are in uncharted territory, or uncharted waters, as I often discuss in the parlance of my day job. And since I believe that both my work and your work, Gabe, and Dr. Lewis's work are at the intersection of research and policy, we don't need to endlessly parse academic semantics. To check that box, I will say we are at very least in undercharted waters, or in insufficiently charted waters. Now, what do you do when you're in an insufficiently charted situation? Well, it helps to examine frameworks that might help summarize what's going on, what's at stake, and what the options might be. I'll throw out a couple frameworks and then hand it over to Dr. Lewis for his insights. Some people argue that history tends to repeat, or sometimes repeats to such a degree, that we need to look to history for our examples to inform what's going on now. And I certainly think that must be taken seriously. I'll briefly engage with 2 historical models that people often discuss. One is the quote unquote Thucydides trap. The other is the historical phenomenon widely known as the Cold War. In terms of the Thucydides trap, I don't pretend to be able to distill it as well as its leading proponents, but what I find significant is that Paramount leader, General Secretary Xi Jinping, has himself invoked the Thucydides trap when speaking with American audiences. I find it concerning that the way in which he's in the way in which he's done it. And I interpret the way he's done it to mean that there's a default risk toward great power war that can only be averted if the US makes preemptive concessions, particularly in the areas of China's self-defined sovereignty claims, first and foremost over Taiwan. I don't think that is the right approach to buy into. So I would treat this concept with extreme caution. I would further underscore analytically that it appears to be predicated on suggesting that there are historical continuities between now and a century ago with World War I, as some have said, let alone with the Peloponnesian War era of Thucydides. And I personally believe that there's been tremendous progress in the international system for all its difficulties, particularly in the areas of transnational production chains and complex financial markets that bind us together in a way that the massive labor migration of a century ago never did. So even with the kind of onshoring of key pharmaceuticals and other things that Gabe and I have advocated for in our recent Baker policy report, I think there's still a degree of interconnection that'll persist in the international system that means it's not 1917 now, and it's definitely not the era of Thucydides. And I haven't even yet mentioned the deterrent power of nuclear weapons. Moving on to the Cold War, I think that's a more applicable analogy if you use it as a loose source of food for thought rather than an absolute straitjacket that obviously won't fit perfectly. Here, though, I would point out a few important distinctions. And I'm reminded of this by the frequent invocation of, by Chinese state media sources and interlocutors really harping on American officials to, quote, abandon the Cold War mentality. I'd like to throw out for some provocative food for thought, not to undersell the risks and the tragedies of the Cold War, but there were also some positive policy measures in the Cold War that US-China relations have yet to approximate. Notably, for example, in the areas of robust arms control and confidence building measure protocols for close encounters between US and Chinese, US and Chinese, or in the previous case, US and Soviet or Russian military vehicles at sea or in the air. So lots more, but I know Dr. Lewis has many insights, so I'd like to virtually hand the mic over to him and look forward to the rest of this discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to work with Dr. Erickson again. It's been quite a while, and also my colleague Gabe Collins on what a very important set of questions and topics. I think, as the person who studies Chinese domestic politics, and it's kind of natural that I'll try and talk a little bit more about where the Chinese side is coming from, and to kind of follow Dr. Erickson's lead. Hopefully we're okay. I can kind of take off from where we're thinking about how much competition do we have versus how much, like the Cold War, actual potential conflict do we have. And the one thing I can just talk a little bit about, especially moving it towards talking about energy more specifically, is just talk about China's energy, system and the relationship with the party. And there's two things I think most Americans in particular, maybe many people in our audience may not be familiar with this. It's easy when we think about China to compare it to the Soviet Union. I mean, red flag, sickles, there's a lot there it's very, very similar in many ways. But on the other hand, it's important in very, very important ways, especially when it comes to energy. And one of the things I think we need to consider is that it is a planned economy, but it's a local planned economy. And the way to just keep that in mind is at the height of the Cold War in the 1980s, in the Soviet Union, there was a Ministry of Statistics. right? Because they controlled all the companies, the factors of production, they controlled all of these things, and they had to actually, I think, rationalize 400 goods by 400 goods. So that's why the Soviet Union produced these amazing mathematicians to create, matrix algebra at 400 by 400. It's pretty impressive stuff. And so they literally had hundreds of thousands of professional statisticians, running things from Moscow, and they had a very centralized party system and a way of controlling things. They also had a very centralized police force. And China is, of course, the Chinese Communist Party is very powerful. And they do indirectly own a lot of things. The difference is, if you look at the height in the 1990s of the Chinese planned system in Beijing, there was never a Ministry of Statistics. There was, a Bureau of Statistics underneath the Planning Commission, but it was painfully small. At one point, I actually went to the related office called the Economic Commission, which was responsible for overseeing all of the enterprises in China, regulatory and ownership-wise for many of the large ones. And I walked in the main gate, and there were these two very large towers. And I asked the gate guard, who was a state council military unit assigned person. I said, which one, where do I go? And he goes, oh, that building belongs to the State Tobacco Company. The other building belongs to the Economic Commission. And I said, why are they the same? He said, because the tobacco company paid for the office of the Economic Commission. So it'd be kind of like going to the Pentagon, and you have two Pentagons, one that's actually Boeing headquarters, and the other one that actually is the Defense Department, right? And that kind of gives you an idea how China ran its planned economy. You had some very large state-owned enterprises. The largest, most profitable one was the State Tobacco Company. But until China actually began to find oil in the far north in the 1960s, it was a resource-poor country, and also very little manufacturing. The tax base was basically Shanghai in the south. But on the other hand, they discovered oil at a very opportune time during the oil crisis in the West. And so China began exporting oil to Japan and the other parts of the world that were being embargoed, during the oil crisis. So in the 1970s and 1980s, China brought into its economy through these oil fields that were run partly by the military, at least on the discovery side. The central government began to say, all right, we're going to we really need this revenue, these dollars and hard currencies to develop our military, our research system, and all these. So they began to give more and more authority to these individual oil fields, and assigned the heads of the oil fields had party ranking equal to the ministers. And so China didn't have a very strong energy bureau or ministry throughout the 1980s and even in the 90s. Instead, you had three oil companies. You had an upstream company called CNPC, a downstream one called Sinopec, and then CNOC was for offshore, where they were trying to entice foreigners to come in and help them develop off of the South China Sea in particular. And anyway, it's, even though China today has a planning commission, they still don't have a Ministry of Statistics. They don't have a Bureau of Statistics. There's an energy administration office. But I guarantee the Shanghai's Energy Bureau is bigger than the central government's one. The Shanghai Planning Commission has more people than the central government's one. So because most industry and enterprises in China are owned by local governments. They're not actually owned by the central government. That said, including the tobacco company, the national oil and gas companies were a big part of the central government's revenue coffers. But they had a lot of autonomy, because as the years went by and they discovered more and more oil fields and they were exporting, they had their own version of the resource curse, where the party became dependent on oil and gas and vice versa, mainly oil. And so these enterprises by the 1990s, they stood alone. They were cash cows, but the leaders of them were their own political blocs. We talked about the petroleum faction in Chinese politics, and so if you wanted to rise to the top of the party, you could go the traditional party route, work in the localities or central government offices, or you could just go up through the national oil, and gas companies. And in the 1990s, they restructured them to make all three of them both upstream and downstream companies. So they're all kind of competing with each other. So in that sense, it's not like most countries that have just one national oil and gas company. It's a little bit like Russia in that there is some competition, and some other countries. But the national oil and gas companies kind of made their own decisions throughout the, up until, the 90s and the first part of this century. They kind of did their own thing. And then Xi Jinping came in. And Xi Jinping was a very unusual person. He's also the son of a very powerful, revolutionary leader. He also, he had also some military background through that and ties to the military. He also was a very successful local leader. He was put in charge of very powerful, rich provinces. So he built up a lot of credibility. And so by the time he got up to the Politburo level, the highest ranks of the Chinese Communist Party, where there were already many other people who had experience with oil and gas, and working in this field. He himself didn't have experience with oil and gas, but he realized that he had kind of unique authority to kind of span both the military, the party, and the government, and including the local governments that he had authority with. And so his way to get back to what Dr. Erickson was saying about what has happened more recently in China, I think a lot of China scholars, myself included, were skeptical. When he came in 2012-13, and he said, well, I'm going to announce an anti-corruption campaign. We thought, well, this is just another one of those things you use to solidify, your control, and then it'll be temporary. It was not temporary. So by 2015, it became very clear that he was going to use this anti-corruption campaign, and there's a lot of corruption in China. And turns out it's very popular with the Chinese people. So Xi Jinping, has turned himself into much more of an autocrat, and especially in very recent years where he extended his term of office so he can indefinitely serve as head of the Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, he's eliminated a lot of opposition. And crucially for, I think, what we're talking about, in particular energy today, he basically wiped out what was left of the petroleum faction. So the national oil and gas company leaders were kicked out because they were tied to a disgraced leader who was a rival in the Politburo. And it took him several years to get rid of that person, Zhou Yongkang, but he did. And he is very firmly in charge. In the next, China is working on its 13th five-year plan at this point. They have all kinds of plans to be more energy autonomous or independent as they see it. But anyway, the result is that China is looking, it never looked like the Soviet Union. And in a way, when it comes to the oil and gas companies, it's now beginning to look more like Russia, in the sense that Putin very firmly controls the national oil and gas companies, and Xi Jinping is doing that. And so that's something to keep in mind. The last thought I just wanted to share was that there's a lot of very economically powerful local governments in China, so that have a population and a GDP equal to many small countries. So Shanghai has its own energy bureau, and even individual oil fields in China overseas and to make all kinds of investments. So my point is that it's not just that Xi Jinping is becoming more autocratic, but local governments in China and subsidiaries of the national oil and gas companies, they have an incentive to go out and do their own thing. And so when we think about the Belt and Road Initiative, it's popularly, it's played as this is Xi Jinping's grand strategy to unite kind of control over Central Asia and the Middle East. Not really. He's trying to do that, but what he's actually trying to do is reclaim what all these local governments and state enterprises, including oil and gas companies, were going out and doing. And so he's used anti-corruption to regain control over these. And then he wants to divert the resources towards these strategic projects. So anyway, I'll wrap up there. I know I've gone longer than I probably should have, but I think it's useful for us to consider that it's a new form of autocracy for China's planned economy. But that doesn't mean the local actors and even subsidiaries of energy companies don't still have a lot of autonomy to do things.
So, Steve, this is excellent. And I love the oil and tobacco interplay, because here in the United States, there's been a dialogue in some parts of the investor community that oil is the new tobacco, obviously for somewhat different reasons. But I wanted to follow up with a question for you, and it really has two distinct parts. One is, given what we've seen in the oil sector, we've seen over the last, really 5 years, a significant push to increase domestic oil production in China, a very large boost in investment to try to get there. And it is just, as far as we're able to tell from the data we see, it has not panned out at all. So I guess question one is, do you see potential there? Have you picked up any sort of empirical signals that there may be a consolidation coming with the state oil companies, the way that we've seen, for instance, with shipbuilding and other enterprises where growth has tapered off, and you suddenly really start to see maybe both physical industrial overcapacity and, perhaps in President Xi's opinion, maybe political overcapacity as well? That would be question one. Question two is, the same way you had a petroleum faction that was very influential for multiple decades in China, do we see any sign that there's something akin to that emerging in the renewable space, given the emphasis on electric vehicles, the growth in wind electricity generation and solar electricity generation, among others?
Let me give some short answers, you ask more if you feel you need more. I would say that the first one, is there going to be further consolidation amongst the national oil and gas companies? I suspect not. If there is consolidation, it would be with some of the smaller oil and gas companies, which they've allowed. So Yanchang, CITIC, they've allowed other players in, and maybe on the traders, the people dealing with oil and gas coming in and out, maybe in that area. But China has, remember that in the end, China wants more gas, and China is heavily focused on getting more gas. It's become more dependent on oil from other places, especially, Middle East, Australia, and increasingly getting more from Russia, right? But China still has this enormous problem of just deathly pollution in the north, and is trying to move as quickly as it can away from coal to gas. Whereas historically, it put all the renewables, nuclear, things like that in the south, which is the economically more vibrant area, and said, well, we could just get by on all this coal, which is under the north anyway. But they've realized the cost of that is that it's created a completely unlivable space around the capital. And so they said, all right, we're moving towards gas, and keep in mind, they want to actually move to electric vehicles, as well, or natural gas vehicles. So several provinces are like Oklahoma. They've moved all their state fleets and things over to natural gas vehicles. So I think that's actually more likely to be why they're going to keep letting this competition go, because they want local governments to also compete in terms of shale gas and non-traditional gas with the national oil companies, because the national oil companies have already made huge investments in pipelines to Central Asia or LNG. And so, the traditional big national oil companies are heavily involved in those, and they didn't want to get involved in things like, non-traditional gas and shale gas. And so the Chinese government still has an incentive to keep that going. And remind me, what was the second question?
Yeah, no, I think you've actually covered it pretty well. What I was going to ask as the second one is, do we see similar political blocks, something akin to the petroleum faction? Do we see any nexus like that starting to emerge on the green energy side, or is this really something that President Xi wants to prevent from happening? Any sort of strong independent political alignments?
Yeah, I suspect not. Xi Jinping is he is wary of creating new oligarchs, especially since his rivals in the Politburo before had Chinese billionaires, manufacturers, things like that. And so he might enjoy working with Huawei, and directing them, in other places, but he's also very leery, because these people have their own jets, they have their own security forces, they have more autonomy than even the heads of the old, national oil and gas companies. So he's got to be leery of those. On the other hand, it's also true that when it comes to renewables in China, unless it's like a very strong locality with a very long history of it, there's a long history of just diverting renewables towards pet projects in China. So far Western China puts in a huge solar farm, and what does it do? It doesn't go towards, housing and everything. It creates cement, where it does ceramics or, petrochemicals. So there's a long history of, renewable energy being diverted. And so right now as well, Bitcoin, data mining and things like that is also run off of a lot of hydro projects in China. So the government does it. It's unlikely, I think, to create some type of central government directed enterprise that can do that.
Okay, so in the spirit of two-part questions, I'll ask one now to Dr. Erickson, and this I think will invoke some of the themes that audience members have been asking about here. And I guess, Andrew, just to put it in a very short form, do you pick up much as you look more at China's external-facing policies, any sorts of discussion of one peak, sort of the idea of peak energy, maybe as growth slows down in China, as we go from the mid 2000s when you had China adding the equivalent of a major country worth of oil demand each year to something now where you are starting to see a slowdown. And then the second question is, do you see much, as you look at this, where Chinese entities are talking more about domestic sourcing of energy and maybe reducing some of their dependence on foreign sources?
These are great questions. I haven't necessarily been in the best position to see the degree to which they would be addressed. There are certainly all manner of discussions in Chinese social media and other space when they're not being actively censored. I think a lot of the discussions that might bear on those questions tend to be about larger, more abstract issues where the dots could still be connected. For example, questions have come up over time. Does China's economy risk slowing down in the way that Japan's did in the 1990s, for example? That's something that I believe has had a certain resonance. I think that there's a great degree of concern about where economic development is headed, which obviously has implications for energy consumption, as well as various efforts at energy extraction and also alternative approaches to energy. I find it fascinating what Dr. Lewis was saying about, and you've been saying about how projects have been promoted to fit well with government priorities and directives, but have been adjusted, perhaps is the politest way to say it, to be in line with local and personal interests. And it is my observation that virtually all analysts well experienced with China have lots of stories to tell in that regard. So Dr. Lewis's broader point that China does not operate under a rigid old style Soviet system is very well taken. There's much more room for flexibility, entrepreneurship, and certain types of, I would say, central local contestation in creative ways than, to my knowledge, the Soviet Union really displayed much of. I'm sure you could find theoretical examples if you looked hard enough at the Soviet Union, but there's definitely a flexibility and dynamism there. So I think what we've discussed plays very well into answering your question. I don't have the most concrete answers at this point for how how it's entering and evolving in Chinese discussions right now.
And that's fine. I think uncertainty is the key theme. I think, for the audience here, the one thing that we can tell you that is highly certain is if you see a restaurant going out of business near your university when you're studying in China, don't eat there. But I think the energy sector.
Gabe and I made that mistake about 2 decades ago.
Yeah, the energy sector, unfortunately, there's not quite as crystal clear of certainty. Now, let me ask both of you a question here. Maybe shift to a bit more positive potential vision for the 2020s and moving forward, and that is, what in each of your opinions is the potential for the energy space to actually be one where, even if the broader strategic relationship has become tense, where some aspects of energy are maybe a pocket where there can still be really good collaboration and other things that frankly advance interests that far transcend each of our individual countries?
Well, perhaps I could start offering some general thoughts, and I think Dr. Lewis would have much more to offer in the way of concrete specifics, if that's all right. One impression that I would like to share is that I think through just a lack of a sense of how things actually work in China, a surprising number of Western media sources and well-meaning organizations and activists, I think, develop grossly exaggerated notions about China's commitment to green technologies as a means of revolutionary policy commitments. I think if you look at the ground truth in China, the green technologies, the green energy, green technologies, green economy space was rightly recognized by Chinese policymakers as a very potent area for investment for export. And certainly in specific areas, there have also been some significant improvements within China itself, widespread adoption of increased use of LNG, for example. But there are so many counter examples, whether it's various approaches to coal that seem designed to reduce pollution in eastern seaboard cities, but without controlling for greenhouse gas emissions. Not to mention the Belt and Road Initiative, that is, for all else that it may be doing, is clearly facilitating the proliferation of dirty coal plants with lack of advanced environmental protections in the developing world. To me, what this adds up to is China has not stolen an unbeatable march in the green economy space. The U.S. is not hopelessly behind. In fact, the U.S. has made its own excellent approaches. So I think it's to be hoped and encouraged that both nations make their own progress, both in technology and in environmental mitigation implementation of those technologies. And hopefully over time, there'll be enough cooperation space for meaningful collaboration in selective areas without that being rendered impossible by illicit technology transfer and other problems. But that's one observation that I think is important to this discussion. Thank you.
Sure, and I agree with many of those points too. And if I can just add to it, I would say, I think one of the, I'm also optimistic, by the way, that I think we have a lot in common with China, and that we can work together with them. And also that I think we have a lot to sell, the rest of the world in terms of best practices, models, and and technology that China won't be able to do. And especially since I think the Chinese reputation when it comes to these matters has suffered a lot recently. And so I imagine a lot of countries around the world are reconsidering. But and there's some areas where I think where we are, and when it comes to finance and things like that, I think the rest of the world is moving pretty closely towards cashless pay systems in a way that we're not. We're stuck with, I agree with Neil Ferguson, the American model of credit cards and stuff like that is a failed system, and we're going to be somewhat like the Japanese system. We're going to have a financial system the rest of the world doesn't really want to work with. And whereas most of the rest of the world is moving towards, cashless society, everything through your smartphone. So there's that. But so I think, on the other hand, we like to use these as well. It's also likely the pandemic will also push that, including things about diagnoses, and passive surveillance, hopefully, for, to make sure people aren't gathering too many in a spot, things like that. There are already American companies are doing this. But if we think about it, I think the part that we can leverage the most is that we still have the best university systems with the right incentives to bring in technology and a healthy relationship between government funding for technology and a strong patent system that China very much envies. And Chinese now have more patents generated every year than the American economy does. So they're going to be like Taiwan and Japan used to be, in the sense of they have an incentive, especially the more they go out in the rest of the world, to have property rights be respected, including intellectual property rights. And they have law firms, and they have a lot of people studying law in America. So they are moving, I think, in that direction, even though there are exceptions to that. But when it comes to energy and environment in particular, the one thing I would say is demand management, I think, would be something that, because already American researchers, including, I think, Berkeley Labs, for example, have worked for many years with Chinese cities and the state of California to basically say, let's try out things in China. So like an individual, information administration, smart use of cell phones to tell people how much energy you're using and to get you to dial back on consumption, especially during peak times. There's a lot of things on demand management side that we could learn. And American companies already, Western companies already use China as a place to try out new products because it's so much cheaper to do survey research. Also, the Chinese police system is privatized enough that they will hand over all kinds of data to survey researchers that Americans are not allowed to do for obvious ethical reasons. But American companies have been part of that. So we might as well benefit somewhat from that and say that, urban spaces in particular and urban energy consumption patterns, as China goes this way in the future, especially since their government is more conscious about cutting down imports and things like that, I think we have a lot potential to work with them and to learn, and also to develop technology that's useful for both of us.
So let me ask a follow-up on that front. I think often we come at this with the idea of the maybe a bit of a American chauvinism, where we think about ourselves exporting technologies and best practices to the rest of the world. What I think both of you, in each of your statements that you just went through in your responses to the prior question, it raises this very interesting conundrum where you may actually have best practices from China as, some of these passive surveillance and, other high-tech things are implemented, but we're going to have a dichotomy because we might like the best practice, but we don't necessarily like the technology or the technology purveyor that comes along with it. Do you think this is a dichotomy that we could overcome? And, if so, what are some ways that we might manage this to help facilitate positive engagement?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just say a little bit about it. Just to say that I'm very skeptical that there is either enough kind of public awareness or American elite awareness about just how much American companies are already part of the Chinese surveillance state. And we are, at least there's more attention now on, American prison system has cameras from China. So are these cameras secretly reporting back to China? But there's a lot of American companies, including ones that are politically well connected, that are doing business in China, including in far Western China.
In Xinjiang, yes.
Of Muslims, creating these, concentration camps and monitoring the population there to a degree that has never been done before, except for maybe the Tibetan population in China. And what the Chinese government is using Western China as a way to test out, a lot of new ways for surveillance. And the protests in Hong Kong are both kind of inspiring Chinese leaders in Beijing to ask for new ways to surveil potential protesters. It also inspires protesters to come up with new ways to counter surveil and to come up with new ways to get around it. So everybody's watching Hong Kong and Taiwan to some degree, and more, there is kind of the growth of a little bit more of a transnational youth movement, at least amongst Chinese language countries and regions like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and maybe Korea as well, even though that's not Chinese. But that's something that actually very deeply worries the Chinese government, since it's usually young people who start protests. But the Chinese government has many protests all the time, especially on environmental issues. And they are constantly looking for new ways to clamp down. So we have to be very careful that we don't become complicit in that. But I would say it's already a little too late, in the sense that there are already many Americans already participating in that. It's going to require, I think, a new public awareness, and then also some political action to change policies to stop this.
So I think you just highlighted another research report that we may all be collaborating on over the next few months here. Well, as I look at our time here, we're down to about 5 minutes. And so what I'd like to do at this point, I see the inflow of questions has slowed a bit. If each of you guys would like, I'd call this the 2-minute warning, and, give each of you a couple minutes, any sort of parting thoughts you want the audience to take away. This is your chance, and fire away.
Dr. Erickson, our guest.
Well, Dr. Lewis and Gabe, I want to thank you and your colleagues once again for having me here. I think this is part of an ongoing set of discussions that will be very important in helping to find a way forward for U.S.-China relations, and frankly, how our world is going to evolve into the future. At the beginning, I tried to offer some discussion, some food for thought on models and analogies that others have invoked in an attempt to try to make sense of U.S.-China relations. I think we've done a good job of just discussing some of the limitations in those models, and some of the distinctive features of China and U.S.-China relations. So, having moved beyond those models as, I think, touchstones for our discussion, I'd like to close by offering a few thoughts on what might be a more applicable framework. And this is something that Gabe and I are going to keep working on. So I hope it can be part of an evolving discussion. For some years now, I've used the phrase competitive coexistence as a conceptual framework for U.S.-China relations. And like any such framework, it should be flexible, it should evolve, and to be effective, it has to be adjusted and appropriated, which means that I don't get to say exactly what it means over time, and neither does Gabe in our work together. But let me share 4 bullet points on what at this point I envision when I say competitive coexistence, a framework for U.S.-China relations. I think that the U.S. should not suppress China wholesale, but rather focus on opposing its harmful behaviors. And I believe this gets us beyond the stale propaganda points of misleading accusations of the U.S., quote, containing China. It's the specific harmful behaviors that China's government engages in certain areas that I believe must be opposed and countered. And to do so, I think it's necessary for the US to accept risk and friction to recalibrate those PRC actions that threaten US vital interests, as well as those of key US allies and partners, and the key rules and norms that make the international system operate effectively. As part of this, I think it's important and necessary to hold US ground and allied ground and systemic ground in contested areas to prevent PRC dominance from occurring, especially in a specific geographic or domain area. Finally, on a positive note, I think it's possible and valuable to reduce tensions and pursue shared interests. But here it takes two to tango. And I believe the US will only be willing to do this as much as the PRC leadership is willing and able to do so. So thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Dr. Lewis.
Thanks. So yeah, I guess my final thoughts is just that I think to return to the idea of a Cold War, I think we definitely do need to be very vigilant going forward, because Xi Jinping is, especially with protests in Hong Kong, being very successful, including steering elections against Beijing supporters in Hong Kong. And then also Beijing tried to interfere in the elections in Taiwan, and it backfired once again. And they ended up hurting the people that they wanted to be running, the Taiwanese government in the future. So Xi Jinping, going into the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, he doesn't look very good. He doesn't have a showcase of the things he really wants to showcase. That just means it's more likely he will play the nationalism card and try to get, especially if there are protests in China, to try and get people to rally around. So we have to be very vigilant, I think, on anything security related, including interference in American elections. And we're actually looking at potential for that by looking at social media and what are some of the limitations on the ability to the Chinese to do that. But on the other hand, it's also, I think the Cold War is a useful example, because I grew up in the Cold War, and, and I can remember, watching, Apollo Soyuz, and watching, with my friends, waiting for the two capsules to connect. And like my friends, I were waiting for the Russians to come through with AK-47s and start shooting the Americans. They didn't. It actually turned out to be a peaceful thing. And I think it's important to keep in mind that we can't overplan too much, because there's unintended consequences. So if people in America had said, let's not work with the Soviet Union, and there were good reasons to not work with the Soviet Union on space, America would not be in space today. We are reliant currently on Russia to get into space, because we set up those relations back then, and so our space program has been reliant on these old ties. And I think it's possible that even as American leaders, some senators recently have said we need to send back all foreign students, don't let them hang around for training for a few years after they graduate, put restrictions on, in particular, students from China. This, I think, will have long-term unintended consequences, because we are a world leader in technology, and China really wants to work with us. We do have to protect ourselves, obviously, but I think we risk cutting off our nose to spite our face if we're not careful. And so that's why I said, let's even remember that even in the Cold War, cooperation actually made sense at some times.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you to both of you, gentlemen. This has been an incredibly wide-ranging and fruitful discussion. Really appreciate both of you joining us. And to all of those who took some time out of their afternoon to join us from the audience, thank you. We wish you a wonderful weekend and look forward to engaging with you soon. Thank you.